Hello, I'm going to be reviewing the Scream franchise. I recently watched Scream Resurrection, which premiered on VH1, and it kind of sparked my interest in wanting to rewatch this franchise again. Um, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not a huge Scream fan. I only like two movies in the movie franchise. I like the first two seasons of the MTV show, but Scream Resurrection I did not like. And that's considered the third season in the TV series. I don't know if I'm gonna be watching and reviewing the TV show, but anyways, that's my general thoughts on the franchise. I'll get more into the movies, but of course, this one really doesn't need an introduction. It's Scream, the first Scream, which came out in 1996. It's directed by Wes Craven and written by Kevin Williamson, which he wrote all the movies except for part 3. The movie stars Drew Barrymore, Neve Campbell, yeah, Courtney Cox, David Arquette, Skeet Ulrich, and Matthew Lillard, and Jamie Kennedy. So basically, as most people know, I know a lot of horror fans have seen this movie, and I also know a lot of non-horror fans have seen this movie. The basic plot of this one is a group of high schoolers are terrorized by a serial killer that is obsessed with horror movies. And every time the killer calls one of the victims, he quizzes them on horror movies before he kills them. And that's basically the gist of the movie. Now, when Scream came out, the slasher genre, basically the horror genre, was dead in the 90s. Before this movie came out, you had a lot of, this is when big horror franchises, the sequels, kept going on, and they were just becoming jokes of themselves and very repetitive and boring. And then there was just a stale period in the 90s where there wasn't like a horror boom, I guess. The only real movies I can think of that were kind of groundbreaking in the 90s is probably like Candyman. I wouldn't call Leprechaun groundbreaking, but that's probably like one of the more memorable movies from the 90s. And then Scream came out. And when Scream came out, it kind of revitalized the horror genre and mainly the slasher genre in the late 90s into the early 2000s. Scream's also one of the more pop cultural horror movies, I guess. It's very meta and self-referential. It, I guess it was more appealing to a mainstream audience, I guess. It had a well-known cast, and most people know that Drew Barrymore is kind of like the Marion Crane in this movie, or Janet Leigh. I mean, she played Marion Crane in Psycho. You think that she's going to be the big star of the movie, and she gets killed off in like the first 10 minutes of the movie. And I think that is why Scream worked when it came out. Now, when this movie came out, I was 5, but so I didn't really know that much about it. Like when I was growing up and stuff, the Scream franchise was one of the big franchises that I grew up with, that I knew about. So I think the elements of having a big name cast of well-known actors and mixed with the humor and the meta-ness and the, you know, not to getting too gory with the kills and stuff. I think that's why this movie was more popular with the widestream or with the mainstream audience. It's really hard to talk about these kind of classic horror movies, and especially like with Scream, since it's such a pop culture phenomenon, most people have seen it. Like I said, like horror fans I know have seen it, but I know a lot of people who are not horror fans and they have seen this movie and they know like who the killer is. Well, sometimes I call him Scream, but they, Ghostface. The costumes popular during Halloween time and stuff. But I think I guess I'll just get into like the some of the great things in it. The opening scene with Drew Barrymore, she gets killed off. That's one of the best opening scenes in a horror movie. Um, it just gets right to the point. She gets a phone call. The killer's asking her all these kind of questions, like, what's your favorite scary movie? And like when she gets more and more into it, he starts making threats, and he has her boyfriend tied up, and he starts quizzing her on horror trivia, and she gets one of the questions wrong, which was who was the killer in Friday the 13th, and she says Jason. But if you're like a horror fan or you're a fan of that franchise, it's actually Pamela Voorhees who is the killer in the original. And I thought that was a really intense scene, how that was built up. Like I said, one of the best openings to a horror movie. He guts the boyfriend. She's running around outside, or she's running around the house trying to get away from Ghostface. She runs outside. Ghostface gets a hold of her, stabs her, and then her parents come home and they hear her moaning on the phone. So they think, they know something's wrong, but they can't find her. They go outside and Drew Barrymore is hanging from a tree with her guts hanging out. And that's how the movie opens. Um, some other cool things I liked about it was is the jokes in it and the references to other horror movies. There's a character in this, called Randy, who is like the horror nerd, and he's the one that I guess the horror fans can relate to. I relate to him because it was nice actually seeing a horror fan in a movie that was, well, he's kind of geeky and not and kind of bumbling, I guess. But he wasn't like he's not like the psycho killer in the movie. He's actually one of the what do you call that? He has his head on right. He's like the horror geek, like ones that we can relate to. I mean, we're not all that goofy, but anyways, he makes a lot of references to horror movies and stuff like that. You know, and there's a great scene in the video where he works at a video store, and Matthew Lillard's character comes in and he's talking to him, and Randy's telling him about the rules of a horror movie, and he said, if you're suspected of a crime, why would you be standing in the horror section? He's like, it's like Prom Night Revisited. If the cops watch it, they'll save time. He goes, there's a simple formula to it, a very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect. Yeah, he's like the one that he knows his horror movie knowledge, and he gives the speech of the rules of the horror movie at the party, like, first you can never have sex, can't do drugs or drink, and never say I'll be back, because you won't be back. Yeah, he's a good character. I like the references. Um, Neve Campbell, who plays Cindy Prescott, I like her in all of these movies. Like in this one, she's the typical innocent final girl, and they kind of play on the final girl trope because most of the time, final girls in slasher movies, they're virgins and stuff like that. But in this one, she ended up having sex, but of course it's with one of the killers, and then he tries to end up killing her, but it doesn't happen, and she becomes the final girl in the rest of the franchise. I like her, like, throughout the rest of the movies, like how she, which I'll get into, I guess, more with the sequels. She first, like I said, first she starts off this innocent, shy, prudish, I guess I don't like saying that word, final girl. And then she slowly develops into like a stronger character with each movie. Now, the one thing that really doesn't work now is that these movies are kind of like if you watch them once, because they're whodunit type of movies. If you have to watch it once, or after you watch it once, it kind of loses its mystery. Now people say, oh, you can go back and like pick up on clues of like what they left behind to make you figure out who the killer is, or the killers in this case is. And some of them were just too obvious, like it's, of course, the killers, I'm not going to spoil it. This movie came out in 96. So, but the killer is Billy and Stu. Now, Stu wasn't obvious, besides like one scene when they're talking about the water fountain by the fountain, and he's talking about gutting someone. Like, I thought, because he's just a jokester and he's kind of rude and don't have no respect for people's emotions, he was just being an asshole. But Billy was kind of more obvious that he is probably the killer, just because he's more brooding, and he's like, I don't know, he's like very possessive and controlling of Sydney. And he says like something to the effect of, why can't you get over your mother's death? Like, he said, my mom and dad, they divorced, but I moved on. And he's like, you should do the same thing, your mom's not here, she's dead. And I'm like, that's kind of like, it just, like, when he said that, it was just it kind of stuck out more that he was the fucking killer, because he had, like, no consideration about her mom, how she felt about her mom's death. And it's only 1 year after her mother was murdered. And so, I don't know, Billy just seemed like, on rewatches, Billy seemed like he was the most obvious red herring, or the one that they're putting more hints to, I guess. And Stu I didn't really pick up that much on Stu, even through rewatches. Um, yeah. The Scream franchise is not known for their kills, but the first movie has two kind of creative ones, I guess. There's the one where I forgot her name. Was it Rose McGowan? Or I think it's Rose McGowan. She plays Tatum, who was Cindy's best friend, which is kind of weird because she's kind of like this preppy, boisterous kind of girl, and she's friends with Sydney, who's like this introverted, quiet girl. But anyways, she gets killed, and she has a confrontation with Ghostface in the garage when she's getting beers, and then he kills her in the garage door. And I know people are like, "Oh, that's not realistic," but it don't matter. It's a movie, and it's one of the better kills in the movie. Now, like the after effect, or like when you see her head getting crushed, you could tell it's a dummy, and also in the after effect. But I still think it's one of the better kills in the franchise, because there's not many that really stand out. It's mainly just stabbings. So, and the other kill is when Matthew Lillard, he gets killed. He gets a TV pushed on his head, and he gets electrocuted. And now for the killer's motivation. Now, they kind of, like, it was good in this movie, I guess, but in the later installments, it kind of got annoying. In 4, they don't do it in 4. It's not the same kind of motivation. And I know one of the killers in 2 has a different motivation, but being that the reason why Billy and Sue started killing, or Billy at least, was because Cindy's mom was a hoe and she was sleeping around, and she slept with Billy's dad, and that's what caused their divorce. I could see that as being a realistic motive for wanting to kill. And Stu, like, I guess it would be more real. That was kind of realistic too. Like, he just tagged along because they're best friends, and they're just gonna. They took their ideas from horror movies and use that as their motive. Now I know a lot of people probably think that's offensive to horror fans, saying like, oh, it's like blaming entertainment or art for violence, but I think it's because you know Billy says it too. He's like, don't blame the movies for creating psychos. Movies make psychos more creative. So I guess he kind of like disproved that a little bit. But yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just rambling. It's kind of hard talking about this movie because so many people have talked about it. I don't really know what to say. Uh, there's two other characters I want to mention. I guess is Gale Weathers. I do not like Gale Weathers in any of the movies. She's just very bitchy and greedy and narcissistic. And I know she's supposed to be like that because she's a journalist and she's supposed to develop over time. But it didn't really seem like she developed that much in any of the movies. Maybe like part 4 a little bit. And Dewey, he's the bumbling cop, and he's like that in all the movies besides part 3 a little bit. He has more character development in that. Which, I mean, I do like Dewey, but he's not very helpful, I guess. And it's their characters. I don't hate the actors or actresses that play them. It's just the characters. Yeah, I don't really know what more to say about this. Like I said, it's a classic movie. Everyone knows about it. Like horror fans, non-horror fans. It's infected the pop culture. So so it's a popular movie, and I just don't really know what more to say about it. Um, but I would highly recommend it, especially if you're a horror fan, or if you're not, if you're trying to get into horror. I guess this would be a good start for that. Um, I mean, even though this movie came out when I was a kid in the 90s, it wasn't the movie that introduced me to horror or got me into it. But I think it's kind of a good step to get if you want to get into the genre. But anyways, that's my review.